Fate has a way of unraveling even the most carefully constructed lives with a single devastating moment of truth. In the cobblestone streets of 19th century Bordeaux, a powerful duke stands frozen in time, his prestigious bloodline and imminent arranged marriage suddenly meaningless as he stares into the faces of two 6-year-old boys, mirror images of himself, standing beside the woman he once loved in secret and abandoned years ago. The market falls silent. The boys look up at him with innocent curiosity, while their mother's eyes hold years of unspoken pain and secrets. One child's simple question hangs in the air like the blade of a guillotine. Is he our father? In a world where titles determine destiny and scandal can destroy generations of nobility, Louis de Montbrison must choose between the crown he was born to wear and the family he never knew existed. But the woman who kept this secret has built walls around her heart that even a duke's power cannot breach. How does one reclaim 6 years of fatherhood lost to pride and duty? How does a woman who survived abandonment learn to trust again? And what happens when two children, raised on stories of a father who never existed, suddenly find him standing before them in all his aristocratic glory? This tale of forbidden love, painful secrets, and redemption in the face of society's cruelest judgments will leave you breathless with each new revelation. Follow our historical romance channel for new chapters every week, where passion and duty collide in the most heart-wrenching ways. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe now, like this video, and share it with fellow romance enthusiasts who appreciate tales of love that defy all odds. Don't forget to save this video to your favorites. You'll want to revisit this emotional journey as it unfolds. Your support allows us to continue bringing these captivating stories to life. The morning mist clung to Bordeaux's stone buildings like a lover reluctant to part at dawn, obscuring the divide between the wealthy upper quarters and the working-class districts below. It was in this hazy boundary where worlds that should never touch were about to collide with the force of destiny itself. Claire Belmont arranged her bread loaves with practiced precision, each placement a small act of artistry despite her exhaustion. She had been awake since 3 o'clock, kneading dough by candlelight while her sons slept in the small room they shared in their modest apartment above a former stable. The scent of fresh yeast and the warmth of the bread against her calloused hands were small comforts in a life built on necessary routines. "Etienne, please don't drag the cart so roughly," she said without turning around, hearing the distinctive rattle of wheels being pulled too quickly across uneven cobblestones. "The bread will be crushed." "It wasn't me, maman," came the immediate reply from Julien, his voice carrying the hint of mischief that told Claire everything she needed to know. She suppressed a smile despite herself. Her twins had been switching identities since they could speak, a private game that sometimes felt like their small rebellion against a world that had given them so little control. Claire allowed them this harmless deception, knowing that in the harsh reality awaiting them, such moments of childish joy would become increasingly rare. The market square pulsed with life, vendors shouting prices, housewives bargaining fiercely, apprentices rushing on errands, and the occasional pickpocket weaving through the crowd with nimble fingers. Claire had secured her small corner beside the convent wall years ago, through persistence and the quiet dignity that made even the most territorial vendors respect her space. The stones behind her back retained warmth from the previous day's sun, a small mercy in the early spring chill that penetrated her worn woolen dress. "Stand up straight, boys," she whispered as she positioned them beside her stall. "Remember what I taught you about greeting customers." Julien and Etienne nodded in unison, their dark curls bouncing against foreheads that bore the same slight furrow when they concentrated. An expression Claire had grown to both love and fear. It was in these moments of serious contemplation that they most resembled their father, a resemblance that grew more pronounced with each passing month, haunting her with memories she fought daily to suppress. The early customers began to approach, servants sent by their masters, laborers wanting something to sustain them through the morning's work, and nuns from the convent slipping out for provisions. Claire's bread had earned a reputation for quality despite her modest pricing. She handled each transaction with quiet efficiency, her sons carefully wrapping the purchases in paper and accepting coins with small, respectful bows she had taught them. "You've taught them well," remarked Sister Marguerite, a regular customer who often slipped the boys extra sweets when Claire pretended not to notice. "They have the manners of little gentlemen." Claire's smile tightened slightly. "They're good boys, they learn quickly." The conversation might have continued, but it was cut short by a sudden change in the market's rhythm. The usual cacophony dimmed as attention shifted toward the main thoroughfare, where the clatter of hooves against stone announced approaching horsemen. Market-goers instinctively pressed themselves against stalls and walls, clearing a path through the narrow street. "The noble procession," someone whispered nearby. "The Duke returns from Paris today." Claire's hands froze mid-motion, a loaf of bread suspended between her basket and a customer's outstretched hands. A cold sensation spread through her chest, making it suddenly difficult to breathe. She had known this day might come. Bordeaux was his ancestral home after all, but she had convinced herself that their paths would never cross. The Duke moved in elevated circles far removed from common market squares. "Maman?" Julian tugged at her skirt, sensing her distress with the intuition that sometimes frightened her. "Are you ill?" "No, my love," she managed, forcing her hands to complete the transaction. "Stay close to me now." The horsemen appeared at the far end of the market, royal guards in blue uniforms with crimson capes, their polished boots gleaming even in the diffuse morning light. They cleared a path with authoritative shouts, showing little concern for the displays they disrupted or the people forced to scramble out of their way. Claire pulled her sons behind her stall, hoping they might somehow remain unnoticed in the commotion. But fate had other designs. A grey stallion with gold-embroidered saddlecloth veered too close to her modest display, its powerful flank catching the edge of her largest basket. The bread she had spent hours creating tumbled across the filthy cobblestones, beauty destroyed in an instant. Julian darted forward instinctively to retrieve what he could, but a soldier's boot pushed him roughly aside. "Mind your place, boy," the man growled. Something primal awoke in Claire, the fierce protective instinct that had sustained her through 6 years of solitary parenthood. She lunged forward, all propriety forgotten. "Don't touch my son." The soldier turned his attention to her, contempt evident in his sneering expression. "Blocking the passage of nobility carries penalties, woman. Perhaps a night in the cells would teach you proper respect." Claire stood her ground, though fear coursed through her. A night detained would mean no bread tomorrow, no income, no food for her children. But retreat now would teach her sons that dignity could be surrendered when threatened. She straightened her spine, preparing for whatever consequences might come. "What seems to be the disturbance?" The voice cut through the tension like a blade, cultured, commanding, and horrifyingly familiar. Claire didn't need to look up to know who had spoken. 6 years had not dimmed the memory of that voice, the way it once softened when they were alone, the way it could convey volumes with the slightest inflection. The crowd parted as Duke Louis de Montbrison descended from his carriage, his tall figure requiring no ornate finery to command attention. Authority emanated from his measured stride, and the unwavering gaze that assessed the situation with practiced efficiency. The soldiers immediately stood at attention, their previous aggression dissolving into deference. "Your Grace," the captain began, "we were merely clearing the way." Louis raised a hand, silencing the explanation with a simple gesture. He surveyed the scene, overturned baskets, bread scattered across dirty cobblestones, a woman standing rigidly with 2 small boys clutching her skirts. Something in the tableau captured his attention, made him pause and look more closely. Claire kept her face downturned, hoping against reason that he wouldn't recognize her. She had changed in 6 years. Hardship had sharpened her features, labor had calloused her once soft hands, and sorrow had etched fine lines around her eyes. Perhaps she was unrecognizable now, just another market vendor beneath his notice. "Look at me," he commanded, not unkindly but with unmistakable authority. Her body responded before her mind could protest, a remnant of what once existed between them. Claire raised her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze directly for the first time in 6 years. The market faded away. The soldiers, the onlookers, even the bread crushed beneath boots, all dissolved into insignificance as their eyes locked in mutual recognition. Louis went perfectly still, the color draining from his face. The composed aristocrat vanished, replaced by a man confronting a ghost from his past. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words emerged. Claire saw the exact moment when his attention shifted from her to the children at her side. She watched his eyes widen almost imperceptibly as they moved between the two small faces upturned to his. The resemblance was undeniable. The same straight nose, the same determined set of the jaw, the same intensity in their gaze. Features that had adorned generations of Montbrison portraits, now perfectly replicated in miniature. Time stretched between them, a silent conversation occurring in the space where words failed. Claire saw questions, accusations, and dawning comprehension cross his face in rapid succession. Louis, always so guarded in public, was momentarily transparent to her, as he had been in their most intimate moments years ago. Etienne, always the bolder of the twins, broke the spell with the innocent cruelty only children possess. He tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked in a clear voice that carried across the now silent market square, "Is he our father, maman?" The question hung in the air between them, a truth neither had prepared to face in such a public manner. Claire's carefully constructed world, the life she had built from the ashes of heartbreak, trembled on the edge of collapse. And Louis, the powerful Duke of Montbrison, betrothed to another woman by royal arrangement, found himself facing a reality that threatened everything he had accepted as his duty and destiny. In that frozen moment, with all of Bordeaux as witness, two paths that had diverged 6 years ago, violently converged once more, bringing with them the reckoning that both had feared and secretly in the darkest corners of their hearts longed for. Louis stood motionless, his mouth slightly parted as if the words he needed had evaporated on his tongue. The market around them, the colorful awnings, the crowds, the sunlight filtering between buildings seemed to blur at the edges of his consciousness. Nothing remained in focus except Claire and the two small boys whose faces reflected his own with uncanny precision. Claire moved with the instinctive protection of a mother who had spent years as both shield and sword for her children. She stepped forward, placing herself between Louis and the twins, a human barrier made of flesh, bone, and 6 years of carefully guarded fear. Her hand, trembling slightly, came to rest on Etienne's dark curls, as if she could somehow protect him from the consequences of his innocent question. For the briefest moment, her eyes met Louis's, and in that glance he saw something that cut deeper than surprise or discomfort. He saw raw terror, the look of someone who had spent years running from a hunter, only to turn a corner and find themselves face to face with what they feared most. "Claire," he whispered, her name emerging as barely more than a breath. She pressed her lips together and offered no response, her silence more eloquent than any words could have been. Louis took another step toward her, but Claire straightened her spine, summoning a dignity forged through years of solitary struggle. Her hands trembled faintly, but her face remained composed, almost cold. She was still the woman he had loved with desperate passion, yet simultaneously a stranger, someone who had learned to bow to no one, not even a duke. Around them, whispers rippled through the gathering crowd. The exact nature of the confrontation remained unclear to most onlookers, but the tension between the noble and the bread seller, the rigid posture of both, and the strange resemblance of the children provided ample material for speculation. Some murmured behind raised hands, while others watched with undisguised hunger for scandal. "Pick up the bread that can be saved," Claire instructed her sons quietly, her eyes never leaving Louis's face. The twins obeyed in silence, kneeling to retrieve what loaves remained clean enough to sell. The crowd drew back slightly, creating space as if fearing contamination from the scandal brewing before them. Louis could not tear his gaze from Claire. His chest rose and fell in a measured rhythm, each breath seeming to require conscious effort. His mind raced toward the only possible conclusion, yet some part of him still struggled to accept what stood before him with such obvious clarity. "Claire," he repeated, his voice steadier now, "is it you?" She met his eyes directly, this time unflinching. She neither confirmed nor denied, but no words were necessary. The answer lived in the profound silence between them, in the way her eyes held his without wavering, a truth too enormous for denial, too painful for easy acknowledgement. Claire methodically packed away the bread that had survived the trampling. Then, without explanation, she took Etienne's small hand in hers and reached for Julien with the other. She turned to leave, her movements deliberate and final. Louis reacted as if something had shattered within him. "Claire, wait." She halted but turned only slightly, her profile rigid against the market's chaotic backdrop. "Not here," she said quietly, her voice carrying a firmness that brooked no argument. "Not in front of everyone." Louis clenched his fists at his sides and drew a deep breath. "Then come with me. We need to talk. Now." Claire didn't answer immediately. Her eyes scanned the crowd that pretended not to watch them, while edging closer with each passing second. She set her jaw in determination before giving a slight nod of acquiescence. They walked in tense silence, the twins between them, as Louis guided them through the market, winding pathways toward a narrow side street where the shadows fell deeper and the windows remained shuttered against prying eyes. The urban murmur faded behind them as they ventured deeper into the alley, finally stopping beneath an ancient stone archway where brick walls damp with morning dew created a small enclosure hidden from the main thoroughfare. Claire maintained a careful distance between them, her posture alert, like a doe prepared to flee at the first sign of danger. "Your kind doesn't venture into these streets without purpose," she murmured, her words barely audible. "Court nobles avoid places like this." Louis stared at her, his breathing still uneven, his expression caught between astonishment and fury. "Why?" he demanded, the single word containing a universe of questions. "Why did you disappear? Why did you never tell me?" Claire regarded him with hardened eyes. "This conversation doesn't belong to just us anymore." "They're my sons, Claire." His voice broke on the final word, the statement at once incredulous, pleading and filled with anger. Claire closed her eyes momentarily, as if the weight of those words physically pained her. When she opened them again, her gaze was clear, determined, though Louis could see the hurt lurking beneath her composed exterior. "Not here," she repeated firmly. "I won't dissect our history in a shadowed alley." Louis stepped toward her, but Claire retreated instinctively. An invisible wall had formed between them in the years of separation, a barrier made of unspoken accusations, abandoned trust, and divergent paths. The twins watched them silently. Julian clung to his mother's hand, eyes wide with uncertainty. Etienne, ever the more adventurous spirit, glanced back and forth between the adults' faces, trying to decipher the strange tension that had transformed the air around them into something thick and difficult to breathe. Claire sighed deeply. "Take us somewhere we can speak, without half of Bordeaux repeating our words for weeks," she said, her tone measured and cold. "Then perhaps I'll tell you what you want to know." Louis nodded, swallowing hard. His eyes drifted to the children and his heart thundered in his chest. This proximity to Claire, to what they had once been to each other, to what they had apparently created together, disarmed him more thoroughly than any political confrontation with his father or diplomatic negotiation ever had. Claire led them further along the narrow passage until they reached the partially open door of an abandoned storage facility that had once served as a cobbler's workshop. The space was dimly lit but dry and sufficiently private. They entered together, and Claire directed the boys to wait near the entrance while she and Louis retreated to the far corner, where their words would not reach young ears. For several long moments, they simply looked at each other in silence. Perhaps that was everything, or perhaps it was too much. The years between them stretched like an unbridgeable chasm. "I don't understand," Louis finally whispered. "I searched for you for months. No one knew anything. You wrote to me once, and then nothing. You vanished as if you'd never existed." Claire looked away, her throat working as she struggled to maintain her composure. "And now I find you here," he continued, "with two children who are identical to me. Have you nothing to say?" She raised her eyes to his, her tone dry, almost caustic. "I have much to say, but I'm not certain you have the courage to hear it." The accusation struck him like a physical blow. "Are you suggesting this was my fault?" "I'm saying," Claire lowered her voice, "that it wasn't solely mine, that there were reasons that I didn't leave on a whim." Louis took a step back as if trying to contain himself, then gestured toward the children. "And they are my sons." Claire remained silent, her stillness an answer in itself. He stepped forward again. "Claire, She narrowed her eyes slightly, resignation spreading across her features. "Yes," she finally admitted. "They are yours." Louis felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. The emotional impact was absolute, devastating in its finality. Despite his suspicions from the moment he saw them, hearing the confirmation aloud made his eyes burn and his body tremble. For years he had imagined various futures for himself, but none included discovering 2 children who had lived half their childhood without knowing him. Sons whose existence had been kept secret from their own father. But before he could process this revelation further, a shadow shifted behind Claire. Louis barely turned his head before he saw her, dressed in navy blue velvet, with a hat both discreet and unmistakably expensive. Standing as if she owned the very scene before her, Countess Madeleine d'Arlac had appeared silently, with the calculated precision of someone well practiced in the arts of espionage and manipulation. Her expression was one of triumphant discovery, like a chess player who had just identified the crucial move in a complex game. "How touching," she remarked, without moving from the threshold. Claire turned slowly, as if unable to believe what she was seeing. Louis's face hardened instantly. Madeleine surveyed the tableau before her, her gaze traveling from Claire to the children with calculated assessment. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained calm, even pleasant. "So these," she paused meaningfully, "are yours, Louis?" Louis remained silent, his refusal to answer forming an answer of its own. She smiled without warmth. "They are yours, aren't they?" The news spread through the gilded corridors of the Palace of Lyon like wildfire in drought-stricken woodland. Within hours of the encounter between Louis and Claire, every corner of the palace's north wing buzzed with a different version of events. Some spoke of a mysterious woman, others insisted the children were living portraits of the Duke himself. But all agreed on one essential point. Something momentous had occurred, something that could potentially alter the succession if not controlled quickly and decisively. In the Winter Wing's tea salon, Countess Madeleine d'Arlac sipped delicately from her porcelain cup, while listening with feigned indifference to 2 ministers' wives, who, unaware of her first-hand knowledge, nervously discussed the morning's events. Madeleine offered no comment. She merely nodded with a slight, contained smile each time someone uttered the word scandal, mentally calculating exactly how this unexpected development might be shaped to serve her own carefully constructed ambitions. Behind the ornate doors of her private chambers, Madeleine d'Arlac paced with the calculated precision of a lioness. The golden light of sunset streamed through stained glass, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across her immaculate silk gown, but her mind was far from admiring such beauty. Her thoughts whirled with mechanical precision, evaluating, classifying, anticipating. The threat had revealed itself, not in the guise of some noble-born rival with political connections, but in the form of a common baker with 2 children. His children. The revelation cut deeper than she had anticipated, but Madeleine was not a woman who surrendered to emotions when strategy could prevail. Claire Beaumont, she whispered the name, testing its weight on her tongue. Her name from the past, now materializing in the present like an unwelcome ghost. She moved to her writing desk and penned a swift note, her quill scratching against parchment with urgent purpose. Within an hour, her cousin Adrian, a well-positioned advisor to the ecclesiastical court with access to civil registries, would receive her request. Trace Claire Beaumont's existence over the past 7 years. Where she lived, where she worked, and most importantly, with whom she had been associated. Every piece will serve to construct a narrative, Madeleine murmured to herself, sealing the letter with a drop of crimson wax. One the court will accept with indignation, but also with convenience. Meanwhile, in the upper chambers of the palace, the Duke of Lyon drummed his fingers against the polished mahogany of his desk. Around him, diplomatic maps and unsigned decrees awaited attention, but his mind was consumed by a more pressing concern. The tapestries depicting historical battles seemed to watch in silent judgment as he anticipated confrontation with his only son and heir. When Louis finally entered, the Duke observed him with experienced eyes. There was unusual fatigue etched into the young man's features, a shadow behind his eyes that spoke of internal conflict. "What happened in that marketplace?" the Duke asked without preamble. Louis closed the door behind him with deliberate care. An injustice? That does not answer my question. The Duke's voice carried the weight of generations of authority. Silence hung between them, thick with unspoken truths. The Duke rose, still imposing despite his advancing years. He approached his son with narrowed eyes, stopping mere inches away. The nobility whispers. The popular press prepares headlines. Will you tell me there is no truth to what they claim? I will not feed rumors, Louis replied, outwardly composed yet visibly tense. No, Louis, not now. The Duke's voice hardened like steel in a forge. If that woman has your children born outside of marriage, what's at stake isn't merely your reputation. It's the stability of the dukedom, the Northern Kingdom Treaty, your commitment to Madeleine. Louis clenched his jaw but remained silent. This absence of denial was confirmation enough. You will resolve this, the Duke continued in measured tones. Discreetly, without scandal, I give you 2 weeks. Then we will announce the date of your wedding. As Louis exited his father's study, the weight of the palace seemed to descend upon his shoulders. The marble columns, the vaulted ceilings, the ancestral portraits, all seemed to narrow the path to a single outcome: obedience. That same afternoon, Louis shed his royal attire for simple clothes. Without escort or announcement, he made his way to the Montreuil district where Claire supposedly resided. The neighborhood carried a bittersweet atmosphere. The dignity of laborers mingled with the harshness of modest living. Bakeries, cobbler shops, and tailoring establishments lined the streets. Open windows released the scents of yeast, coal, and simmering soup into the air. He found the house on a narrow street, small, with an iron gate that desperately needed paint. When he knocked, a child answered, his small face brightening with recognition. "Mama," the boy called out, "it's the gentleman from the marketplace." Claire appeared instantly. Upon seeing Louis, her expression tightened, but she silently gestured for him to enter. Inside, the home was modest but meticulously kept. Flour dusted the table alongside molds and a pitcher of water, the workspace of a mother who had managed to survive without seeking favors. Louis tried to speak, but Claire was direct. "Why are you here? I need to understand. I need to see you. I need to know." Claire crossed her arms, creating a barrier between them. "They are not pieces in your games, Louis. You weren't there when they needed you most. You vanished for 6 years. How could I appear when I didn't know where you were?" His voice carried genuine pain. Claire offered no response. The silence between them grew dense with unvoiced accusations and unanswered questions. Louis lingered, observing the children with attention that bordered on reverence. One touched his chin while thinking, exactly as Louis did. The other furrowed his brow in concentration, mirroring Louis's own habit. These were not merely coincidences. They were invisible bonds manifesting despite years of separation. Claire noticed his realization. "I don't need you to confirm anything," she said coldly. "I just need you to leave us in peace." "I can't," he answered, his voice barely audible. "They are mine." She held his gaze for a long moment, but offered no confirmation. When Louis finally departed, he felt more confused than ever. His love for her had not diminished, but it was now enshrouded in layers of pain, distance, and mistrust. The past could not be altered, and the future seemed impossibly complex. In the western wing of the palace, Claire's name had begun to circulate amidst mockery and speculation. Madeleine had discreetly introduced copies of supposed documents that questioned Claire's moral character. Nothing confirmed, but sufficient to plant seeds of doubt. They spoke of a lover, of a questionable past, of decisions unbecoming for a woman who now claimed to be the mother of potential dukes. Louis struggled to maintain composure as pressure mounted daily. The Duke reiterated his position. Madeleine offered smiles laced with equal parts sweetness and warning. The populace began to divide between those who supported truth and those who demanded an untarnished figurehead. One night, seeking refuge in the palace library, Louis searched desperately for some old letter. Some trace that might confirm his connection with Claire had not been merely a cruel twist of fate. His hands moved through parchments with quiet desperation. Alone among wooden shelves and the scent of aging books, he discovered a memory in the form of a drawing, a pencil portrait of Claire he had created when she still lived at court. The sight sent a sharp pain through his chest. What drove him wasn't mere desire. It was something deeper. Belonging, absence, a pain he could no longer pretend didn't exist. The library door suddenly burst open. The kingdom's chancellor entered, his face ashen, sweat beading on his forehead. In his hands, he clutched a document bearing a fresh golden seal. "Your Highness," he said without ceremony, "this has arrived from Paris." Louis took it wordlessly, broke the seal, unfolded the parchment, read, and felt his stomach plummet into an infinite void. It was an official engagement decree signed by the king himself, with a definitive deadline for his marriage to Madeleine d'Aglac. Rain fell softly over the tiled roofs of the artisan district, enveloping the neighborhood in a thin mist that diffused the light from street lamps and made the cobblestones glisten like glass. The scent of damp firewood and baking bread mingled with the murmur of water flowing through channels as narrow streets emptied with the advancing night. Claire secured the door of her small house with 2 locks, an almost automatic gesture she had repeated for years. The interior, modest yet warm, was illuminated by the gentle glow of an oil lamp. The twins slept in the back room, curled beneath woolen blankets, their faces serene, cheeks still warm from the heat of the oven Claire had lit earlier. She allowed herself a moment to watch them before returning to the main room. They breathed in perfect unison. They were her sole purpose. Lucette, her neighbor and most loyal friend, sat in a rocking chair by the fire, her gnarled hands wrapped around a cup of herbal infusion. Her small dark eyes followed Claire as she removed her apron and collapsed into the chair opposite. "You came home later today," Lucette murmured. "You went to see the Duke." Claire glanced at her sideways. There was no need for pretense. Lucette always knew more than she revealed. "He found me," Claire replied softly. "It was unexpected." Lucette nodded, as if she had been waiting for this confession for years. She didn't ask, she demanded, "What did he want?" "He wanted to know why I left, why I never wrote, why I never told him about the children." Lucette took a sip from her cup before speaking again. "And you?" "I didn't know what to say," Claire admitted. "For so long I convinced myself he didn't need to know, that he was better off not knowing." "And now?" Claire's gaze drifted to the window, where rain transformed the glass into a canvas of blurred lights and shadows. "Now everything changes." Lucette studied her with the wisdom of years. The Duke's son won't simply walk away after discovering he has children, and his fiancée won't easily surrender what she believes is rightfully hers. "I don't want anything from him," Claire insisted. "It doesn't matter what you want anymore." Lucette's voice carried the weight of certainty. The moment he saw those children, his children, in the marketplace, a battle began. And like it or not, you stand at its center. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the roof like distant war drums. Claire closed her eyes, remembering Louis's face as he had observed the twins. The wonder, the recognition, the undeniable connection that had formed instantly, despite years of absence. She had fled the palace 6 years ago, believing she was protecting everyone. Now she wondered if she had merely delayed an inevitable confrontation, one that would reshape not just her future, but the destiny of the entire dukedom. What neither Claire nor Louis knew was that at that very moment, in a dimly lit room across the city, Madeleine d'Aglac was reviewing documents, real and fabricated, that would soon unleash a storm no royal decree could control. Lucette set her teacup aside, her weathered face growing solemn in the amber glow of the oil lamp. The shadows deepened around her eyes as she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a grave timbre that demanded truth. "Claire," she said, "I've never asked before, but I believe the time has come. What really happened that day? The day you left?" Claire remained silent for a long moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, she rose and walked toward a small wooden chest kept beneath the window. She opened it carefully, revealing its sparse contents. Inside, wrapped in a worn piece of cloth, lay a folded letter, its edges yellowed by time, creases deepened by years of secret contemplation. She held it in her hands as if it might burn her flesh. "This letter arrived," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sealed with the palace insignia. Supposedly from Louis. It stated that what we had was a mistake, that his engagement was imminent, that he never wanted to see me again, that I should disappear, forget him entirely. Lucette's brow furrowed with suspicion. Did you read it? All of it? Claire shook her head, her eyes fixed on the folded paper. I couldn't. I opened it, but reading that first sentence was enough. I was pregnant. Alone. I couldn't face what was coming if I continued hoping for something from him that would never materialize. Yet you kept it all these years. Claire nodded silently. Lucette extended her hand, but Claire did not relinquish the letter. I don't know if I want to know the truth, she whispered, her voice catching. Perhaps what's written there isn't your truth, Lucette suggested gently. Perhaps it's someone else's. Claire, have you never considered that the letter might have been manipulated? The question fell upon Claire like a deluge of ice water. She had never allowed herself to entertain such a possibility. For 6 years, she had nurtured resentment to avoid collapsing under the weight of sorrow. But now that she had seen him again, witnessed how he looked at the children, felt the tremor in his voice, the question became dangerously compelling. Lucette rose with effort, leaning on her walking stick. Her eyes, though dimmed by age, gleamed with clarity. You are not one to run away, Claire. Someone made you run. Perhaps it's time to discover who did it. In the heart of the palace, Louis was traversing the same path from a different angle. He walked through the private gallery connecting the royal chambers to the library, candle flames flickering against tapestried walls, the echo of his footsteps resonating in the silence. He had spent the afternoon interrogating his former tutor and current steward, Victor. The elderly man had received him in his quarters with the stiffness of one who carries years of secrets. Louis had wasted no time with pleasantries. What do you know about Claire? He asked directly. Who knew about us? Victor lowered his gaze. Your Highness, such questions lead nowhere beneficial. Then don't waste my time. Someone interfered. Victor hesitated. The almost imperceptible movement of his hands betrayed an internal struggle. I heard rumors, nothing confirmed. But in those days, the Duchess mother still wielded influence, and Countess Madeleine was already cultivating connections with your family. Louis straightened as if electricity had coursed through his spine. Her. The word fell between them like a blade. Victor did not respond, but his silence was confirmation enough. That night, Louis descended to the palace's subterranean archives. With a special key, he accessed the correspondence records from the year Claire disappeared. He traversed dusty shelves, unrolled parchments, examined seals with meticulous attention. Then he found it. A letter registered with his signature, dated the exact day Claire had vanished. Beside it lay a second, nearly identical copy with different wording. A forgery. His blood turned to ice. Someone had intercepted his message and replaced it with another. Cruel, false, devastating. His fury wasn't explosive but glacial, precise. An indignation born not merely from personal betrayal, but from the theft of everything that might have been. The following day, as Louis discreetly questioned palace scribes, Madeleine received a letter from her informant. The message was brief, but sufficient. Claire Beaumont had never married. She had never worked for another noble house. She had no close relatives, no networks, a woman alone. Vulnerable to the right eyes, dangerous if left unchecked. Madeleine sat at her dressing table, fingers toying with a golden hairpin. Her face reflected studied serenity, but her eyes calculated with cold precision. She knew what needed to be done, not with violence, not with scandal. Those were crude instruments. All she needed was to frighten Claire, to demonstrate that her presence was unwelcome, to remind her how easily one could vanish into the city's darkness, especially when no one of importance would ask questions. That night, after Claire extinguished the lamps and left the unread letter on the table, she believed the pre-dawn silence was her only companion. She did not hear the soft footsteps outside. She did not feel the draft that slipped through the door's crack. She only noticed something amiss when, returning from the kitchen, she spotted a folded paper on the floor. She picked it up, her heart quickening. It bore no sender's name or signature, only a sentence written in dark ink with tight strokes. If you don't leave this time, it will be too late to run. The smell of smoke reached her first, subtle like a warning seeping beneath the door. Claire had been in the kitchen storing rolls for the following morning when she felt the burning in her throat. A moment later, Julian ran in from the bedroom, wide-eyed and alarmed. "Mama, it smells bad outside." Claire rushed to the window, and what she saw paralyzed her momentarily. Black smoke spiraled from the neighboring bakery's roof, thickening rapidly. Then came the sound, a sharp cracking, like bones breaking, followed by distant screams as someone ran for help. She didn't think, only acted. She grabbed the twins by their hands and pulled them toward the street. As flames began to emerge from the bakery's side, the heat became unbearable, the air dense. Neighbors shouted names amid the chaos. Claire pressed the children against her body, shielding them as they moved away. It was then that a wind-blown spark landed on the eve of her own home. A curtain ignited in seconds. There was no time to save anything. The flames devoured the wooden walls as if they had been waiting for this moment for years. Fire, an ancient, hungry beast that distinguished not between sin and bread. Claire could only watch in silence as the place where she had built her refuge, her home, her everything, disintegrated before her eyes. Luzette appeared shortly after, assisted by a young neighbor. "You're alive," she exclaimed upon seeing them safe. Claire nodded, her face covered in soot. She wasn't crying. Not yet. Her hands trembled, but her mind remained alert, too alert. The fire, the threat slipped under her door. Everything happening too conveniently, too opportunistically. Part of her wanted to believe it had been an accident. The other part knew better. Hours later, when neighbors had finally subdued the flames with buckets and wet blankets, Claire sat with the twins in Lucette's house. The children, exhausted, slept with intact innocence. She, however, could not close her eyes. She knew she couldn't stay, and only one person could help her. Louis arrived as soon as he received the message. He came alone, without escorts, dressed in simple clothes. Seeing Claire with her ash-stained face and hair loosened by chaos, his heart stopped. He said nothing at first, only stared at the ruins of what had once been her home. Then he turned to her. "Come with me." Claire regarded him with distrust. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered. "You won't be visible. There are empty rooms in the East Wing. No one uses them. No one will see you. And what happens if they do see us?" Louis raised his face, his gaze hardened by contained anger. "I don't care." The words hung in the smoke-tinged air between them. In that moment, Claire recognized something in his eyes she had not seen 6 years ago. Not just love or passion, but a resolute defiance against anyone who would stand in his way, including his father, including Madeline. "The children need to sleep somewhere safe tonight," she conceded finally. "And after tonight?" Louis asked. Claire looked toward the twins, still sleeping under Lucette's watchful eye. "After tonight, we need to read a letter." The palace's East Wing had remained largely unused since the death of Louis's mother. Dust sheets draped over furniture created ghostly silhouettes in the dim light, as a trusted servant led them through a concealed servant's passage. The twins, half asleep and bewildered, clung to Claire's hands. "No one comes here," Claire whispered. "Only the necessary staff for cleaning, and they're loyal to me," Louis assured her. "These were my mother's private chambers. My father hasn't allowed anyone to disturb them since she passed." The rooms, once unveiled, revealed faded elegance, a world Claire had glimpsed but never belonged to. Ornate furnishings, silk draperies, painted ceilings depicting mythological scenes. The twins' eyes widened with wonder, despite their exhaustion. As Claire settled the children into a bed far too grand for their small bodies, Louis watched from the doorway, transfixed by the tenderness with which she tucked them in, smoothed their hair, whispered reassurances. When she finally stepped away, he led her to an adjoining sitting room. "I found something," he said, his voice low. "In the archives. A letter registered with my signature dated the day you disappeared, but there was a second copy, altered, forged." Claire's breath caught. "I received a letter that day." She pulled the crumpled paper from her pocket. "I couldn't bring myself to read past the first line." Louis stared at it, recognition and horror dawning simultaneously. "That's not my handwriting." With trembling fingers, Claire unfolded it completely for the first time in 6 years. As they read together, The carefully constructed lies unraveled before them, cruel words designed to break, to sever, to exile. "This was never from me," Louis whispered, his voice tight with rage. "I wrote to you that day, but what I wrote was that I loved you, that I wanted to defy my father's wishes, that I wanted you to wait for me while I resolved matters with the Northern Kingdom Treaty." Claire closed her eyes, years of misunderstanding crashing down like the walls of her home. Who would do this? But they both knew. The question wasn't who had done it, but who stood to gain the most from their separation. "The fire tonight wasn't an accident," Claire said suddenly. Louis's expression darkened. "No, it was a warning." He moved closer, his hands hovering near hers without touching. "I won't let anyone threaten you or our children again." "Our children," Claire repeated softly, the words strange yet inevitable on her tongue. "What happens now, Louis? Your engagement is still real, the treaty still matters. Your father still expects—" "I don't care what he expects," Louis interrupted, a new determination hardening his features. "For 6 years I've lived someone else's version of my life. I've lost enough time." Outside the window, dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In a distant wing of the palace, Madeleine d'Aglac prepared for the day, unaware that her carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. And in the city below, amid the charred remains of Claire's bakery, investigators would soon discover that the fire's origin was no accident, a revelation that would set in motion consequences no one, not even Madeleine, could control. For the first time in years, Claire felt the weight of truth behind words. Not empty promises or protocol gestures, just raw, unembellished honesty. An unmarked carriage transported them to the palace under dawn's protective veil. They entered through the rear, bypassing the main wing's servants. Louis settled them in a forgotten apartment once reserved for visiting musicians and artists, a place overlooked by nobility, but still dignified. Claire didn't ask questions. Any refuge was preferable to the streets. In the days that followed, Louis ensured they wanted for nothing. Clean clothes, warm meals, books, even toys for the children. Initially, Claire resisted this comfort, but her children's joy made resistance futile. The boys were enchanted, amazed by the spaciousness, the tall windows, corridors where they could run freely without reprimand. And then began the most dangerous development of all, proximity. Louis visited every afternoon. He would sit with them in the greenhouse where geraniums still bloomed despite autumn's chill. His gestures were initially awkward, like someone struggling to remember the rules of a forgotten game. But gradually, the children embraced him with natural ease. They shared secrets, displayed drawings proudly, laughed at his jokes, even tried teaching him tongue twisters with childish determination. Claire observed from a distance. Sometimes she pretended to read while listening to their laughter. Other times she simply watched Louis, a bittersweet ache spreading through her chest because he fit too perfectly into the picture she had spent years convincing herself could never exist. One night, as Claire tucked Julian into bed, he looked up at her with innocent eyes that held wisdom beyond his years. "Do you think Papa will stay with us forever?" he whispered. The word pierced her like a blade. "Why do you call him that?" "Because that's how I feel," Julian replied simply, as if stating an obvious truth. Claire had no answer, her thoughts tangled like yarn, impossible to unravel in the face of her son's unguarded heart. The following day, Louis invited her to walk through the gardens. She accepted out of courtesy, telling herself it meant nothing. They spoke little, but within their silence existed more meaning than many conversations held in her lifetime. That same evening, Claire left the children's room and traversed the darkened hallway toward the kitchen, seeking water. She hadn't expected to find Louis standing there, a solitary figure before the window. She froze. So did he. The air between them thickened with 7 years of unspoken words. Louis took one step forward, then another. Claire didn't retreat, but lowered her gaze as her breathing quickened. He raised his hand with gentle deliberation, as though fearing he might shatter her with his touch. His fingers hovered near her cheek, not quite making contact. She closed her eyes. The tremble of her lips betrayed her. And precisely then, hurried footsteps echoed from the corridor's end. Claire turned abruptly. Louis lowered his hand. From the shadows emerged Madeleine, dressed in dark velvet, her curls arranged with aristocratic elegance, her eyes fixed upon them like gleaming daggers. She wasn't alone. Behind her appeared the kingdom's chancellor, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The hallway remained shrouded in half-darkness long after Madeleine and the chancellor disappeared down the gallery. Claire had fled without a word, her face ashen, jaw clenched tight, as if contained tension were all that kept her standing. Louis remained alone for a few seconds more beneath the dying lamplight, feeling his throat constrict. Their almost shared moment had vanished, devoured by the cruel reality of court politics and appearances. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. While her children slumbered peacefully in their shared bed, she sat by the window wrapped in a fine shawl that wasn't hers. The East Wing garden stretched before her in shadows, dotted with distant lantern light. In her lap, a handkerchief trembled between unsteady fingers. She couldn't deny what she'd felt in that hallway, the warmth of Louis's gaze, their proximity, that silence pregnant with memories and promises unfulfilled. But fear gripped her equally tight. Not fear of him, but of everything surrounding him. The weight of his name, the world's judgment, how easily everything could crumble at the whisper of rumor. And her children, her precious boys with their sweet smiles and tousled hair, they were vulnerable, exposed. Claire couldn't afford the luxury of romantic fantasy. She'd made that mistake once before. By morning, she avoided Louis with practiced discretion. She pretended not to hear his knock, asked a servant to convey her supposed illness, and maintained silence during breakfast. Even when Julian excitedly recounted Louis's promise to teach them riding on ponies in the royal gardens, she couldn't bring herself to smile. In the days that followed, Claire became a shadow. She walked silently through corridors, avoided crossing paths with Louis, and spoke only when necessary. But the children, they flourished. Each morning they ran toward the stables with the same vibrant energy that had propelled them through life in the working-class district. Louis received them with patience. Initially awkward when one would take his hand or embrace him without warning, he gradually began to cherish these moments. He discovered Etienne was restless, perceptive, perpetually curious. Julian, by contrast, was reflective, observant, with an unexpected sense of humor. During their first riding lessons, the boys fell more often than they stayed mounted, but laughed with each stumble. Louis would help them up, dust off their clothes, and speak with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. Sometimes he caught himself pausing to watch them nap in the greenhouse, hair disheveled, cheeks flushed from sunshine, and then he would think of Claire, of everything he had missed. One afternoon, while teaching Julian how to hold the reins properly, the boy fixed him with the solemn seriousness only children can wield with complete conviction. "Are you going to marry Mother?" he asked. Louis felt his heart stutter. "Why do you ask that?" Julian shrugged. "Because you make her happy when she doesn't notice." Louis had no response. That night he knocked on Claire's door. She didn't open it but listened from the other side, heart pounding against her ribs. "I don't want to pressure you," he said, voice low and sincere. "But I cannot continue pretending this doesn't matter to me. I want to be with you, with all of you." Silence stretched between them, thick as winter fog. "I won't give up," he added barely above a whisper. "I did that once, not again." His footsteps receded. Claire pressed her forehead against the door, squeezing her eyes shut. She knew she stood at the precipice of something she couldn't control. And she knew that if she yielded, if she allowed him fully into her life, there would be no turning back. Louis belonged to a world built upon pillars of pride, alliances, and appearances. A world that never forgave mistakes or loves that defied convention. And the children already adored him. If she lost all three, she wouldn't survive. That night, while the palace slept, Claire rose silently. She packed hastily, 2 changes of clothes, a small bottle of lavender essence, a handkerchief once belonging to her mother. She prepared coats for the children and bread wrapped in cloth. She took only what was essential. On the bed, she left a torn sheet of paper with trembling handwriting. Lucette would know what to do with it. Heart in her throat, she entered the children's room. They slept deeply. She knelt beside their bed, kissed their foreheads, stroked their curls with the delicacy of someone memorizing an unrepeatable moment. She remained thus for several minutes, allowing tears to slide silently down her cheeks. Then she woke them gently. Come, my loves, it's time to go. It's... Julian grumbled but obeyed. Etienne clutched his rag doll while Claire helped them dress noiselessly. They exited through the east wing's back door, along the same corridor through which they had arrived on that night of the fire. The guards had been changed. These new ones didn't recognize them. Claire had prepared her story well, claiming they were household staff departing for a sick relative. The darkness aided their escape, shadows concealing their faces as they passed through the servants' gate. What Claire hadn't anticipated was the figure watching from the upper balcony. Louis stood motionless, observing their departure, his knuckles white against the stone balustrade. He had suspected. Court whispers traveled fast. The Chancellor's visit hadn't been coincidental. As their silhouettes disappeared into the night, Louis made a decision that would alter the course of 3 kingdoms. He would not lose them again, not to fear, not to duty, not to the invisible chains of his position. In her haste to leave without being detected, Claire had overlooked one crucial detail. In this world, no one truly disappeared without a trace, and Louis had resources she couldn't begin to imagine. The game of hearts and crowns had only just begun. Dawn was breaking as the small family reached the city outskirts. Claire looked back once at the palace spires, now gilded with morning light. For a fleeting moment, doubt clouded her determination. But then Julian squeezed her hand, his eyes trusting, and she knew she had made the only choice she could. What she didn't know was that Louis had already sent riders in all 4 directions. The Duke wasn't merely searching, he was hunting, and this time, he wouldn't let protocol or propriety stand between him and what he had finally recognized as his true family. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, Madeleine sat before her mirror, meticulously arranging her appearance for the day ahead. The Chancellor's words echoed in her mind. The succession must be secured. Those children cannot remain. She smiled at her reflection, cold and calculated. The game was indeed just beginning. The palace slept. The world slept. Claire refused to look back as the moon guided them across the garden gate before darkness enveloped their small figures. The children's drowsy questions had ceased hours ago, replaced by the rhythmic sound of their breathing as they walked the empty roads. She held their hands tightly, ignoring the ache in her chest that seemed to grow with each step that carried them farther from the palace, farther from him. Morning arrived with golden rays filtering through the trees, illuminating Louis as he approached the east wing rooms, intending to see the children before his council meeting. He carried a book of star illustrations that had captured Julian's interest days before, his steps lighter than they had been in years. He knocked on the door with a smile that quickly faded when no response came. Frowning, he pushed it open carefully, only to be greeted by cold air, dense silence, and empty beds. He rushed inside, heart hammering against his ribs as his eyes confirmed what he already sensed. The missing coats, the open trunk, the abandoned possessions. A folded piece of paper rested on the bed. Louis took it with trembling hands, unfolding it to reveal a single phrase that sent his world crashing down around him. "Forgive me." Again. The paper trembled between his fingers as though it burned his skin. The few words written with the urgency of pain and resignation, tearing through his composure like a blade. For several seconds, he remained motionless, the silence of the room pressing in on him, cold air seeping through the partially open window, like the tangible trail of emptiness left in the space where just hours ago his children had slept. His children. He leaned over the unmade bed, pressing his fists against the still warm blankets, inhaling their lingering scent, childhood, freshly baked bread, hope. Something inside him cracked with devastating force. It wasn't just Claire fleeing this time. It was the 3 of them, and this time he would not allow it. Without requesting escorts or explaining himself to the Duke, Louis departed the palace before sunrise, mounted on a horse he had saddled himself, travel clothes still dirty from previous journeys. As the sky brightened with timid sunlight, he rode through back roads, crossing villages and farms, making discreet inquiries without revealing his identity. No one recognized the name Claire Beaumont, but mentioning a woman with twin dark-haired boys was enough to raise an eyebrow, indicate a direction, or prompt a murmur pointing northward. The hours stretched endlessly as Louis's body began to protest the lack of rest, but he refused to yield. His determination overpowered exhaustion. He couldn't recall ever feeling such desperate need to find someone, not from pride or anger, but from love, from truth, from the irretrievable time lost between them. Nightfall had descended when, arriving at a dusty crossroad, he discovered an abandoned cart before a small stone house with tiny windows and a chimney exhaling fresh smoke. A dog's barking alerted him, followed by the soft sound of a door hastily closing. Louis dismounted and approached with steady steps, though his heart pounded painfully against his chest. He knocked once with his knuckles, then waited with held breath. The door opened just a few centimeters. On the other side stood Claire. Their eyes met across the threshold, and though she showed no surprise, her expression transformed instantly. She looked at him as if she had been expecting him without wanting to admit it to herself. Without a word, she opened the door completely. Louis entered silently, enveloped by the scent of hot soup and damp firewood that filled the modest dwelling. In the corner, the children slept under a blanket, exhausted from their journey, undisturbed by his arrival. Claire led him outside to the small back garden where the earth remained damp from afternoon rain. There, beneath the fading light of the cloudy sky, they finally confronted each other. "How did you find me?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though they stood alone among the silent trees and gathering shadows. "Lucette," Louis replied simply. "She kept your letter, and I quickly understood you wouldn't leave without her help." Claire looked away, unable to meet his penetrating gaze. "I was afraid," she murmured, arms wrapping around herself against the evening chill. "Afraid that everything would repeat itself, that your promises would break again, or worse, that I would believe them again." Louis nodded slowly, accepting her words without protest. "I cannot blame you for that." Claire crossed her arms tighter, the wind pushing her hair back from her face. Her eyes shimmered not with tears but with contained emotion that threatened to overflow. "It wasn't just for me," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "It was for them. They're watching them, evaluating them. They won't leave them in peace as long as you remain who you are." Louis stepped toward her, closing the fragile distance between them. "Claire, I've started investigating what happened 7 years ago. The letters, the records, nothing aligns. They told me you had abandoned me, but you received a false letter." His face hardened with determination, eyes flashing with newfound purpose. "Who sent it? Why? Everything was manipulated. We were deliberately separated." Claire's eyes widened in surprise, the revelation striking her like physical force. "You know?" Louis's jaw tightened as he responded, "I'm discovering it. Someone did everything possible to keep us apart, and I won't allow them to do it again." The silence that fell between them was dense and tense, yet not hostile, as if their hearts still sought the same melody, though years had detuned the music they once shared so effortlessly. Louis raised his hand toward her face without touching her, letting it hover near her cheek in a gesture that bridged past and present. "Don't run away again," he said, voice deep with emotion. "Not for me, for them. They deserve the truth. They deserve to know they aren't mistakes or shadows cast by our past." Claire closed her eyes, surrendering momentarily to the comfort of his nearness. "I don't know if I can, Louis. There are so many things I don't understand and others that hurt too much to examine." "Then let's start understanding them together," he replied with such firmness and sincerity that Claire felt something within her yielding, not completely, but enough to stop resisting the inevitable tide pulling them toward each other. Louis moved closer, until their faces were separated by mere centimeters. She could feel his breath, the warmth radiating from his skin, memories and yearnings and unspoken words concentrating in this suspended moment between heartbeats. Claire didn't move away. The wind whispered through the trees around them as the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Just as their lips were about to touch, the creak of wheels shattered the spell. They turned simultaneously toward the sound. A black carriage, discreet yet unmistakably luxurious, stopped before the cabin, its polished surface reflecting the fading light like obsidian. From it descended a tall figure dressed in a dark coat reaching his knees, collar raised like a wall against the cold that had descended with nightfall. Beside him, another man emerged with measured, almost ceremonial movements that spoke of court training. Louis paled visibly while Claire narrowed her eyes, instinctively stepping closer to the house where her children slept. The kingdom's chancellor walked toward them with firm steps, followed by an emissary from the royal council. Neither spoke at first, merely observing the scene and measuring every detail with calculating eyes. The modest garden, the mud beneath Louis's boots, the proximity between him and Claire that told its own story. Then their gaze shifted to the window behind which the children slept, unaware that the outside world had come searching for them with purpose and authority. The chancellor stopped a few paces away, his voice like a broken bell, dry and solemn in the gathering darkness. The Duke demands your immediate presence and wishes to see the children. The night closed around the small farm with a thick air of uncertainty. After the Chancellor's appearance, there was no need for discussion or debate. Claire remained motionless, arms crossed protectively over her chest, while Louis accepted the Duke's summons with a coldness born not of obedience, but of the certainty that fleeing was no longer an option for any of them. The look he directed at Claire before climbing into the carriage contained volumes of unspoken promises and warnings. "Don't leave," it seemed to say with fierce intensity. But she offered no response, neither in words nor gestures, her face a careful mask hiding the turmoil within. The carriage departed under the pre-dawn shadows, disappearing into the mist that clung to the fields and trees like ghostly fingers. Claire remained on the threshold, watching until the last trace of movement vanished from view. Behind her, the children still slept, blissfully unaware of the forces moving around them like pieces on a chessboard. Though they weren't officially detained, the presence of two councilmen patrolling the property's boundaries transformed the farm into a cell without bars, a prison of silence and waiting that closed around Claire like invisible chains. She felt watched with every step, every movement, every glance toward her sons carrying the weight of an unspoken threat that hung in the air like storm clouds. There were no direct orders, but she understood the message with perfect clarity. She was under scrutiny, and only her silence maintained the delicate balance, keeping them all safe for the moment. The knowledge settled like ice in her stomach as she returned to the children's bedside, brushing their dark curls from foreheads so like their father's. At the palace, Louis entered directly into the council chamber where the Duke awaited, surrounded by ministers, diplomats, and members of the high clergy, whose solemn faces reflected the gravity of the situation. The atmosphere was suffocating, charged with distrust and calculation. The scandal was no longer whispered rumor, but overflowing reality cascading through the corridors of power, threatening foundations built over generations of careful political maneuvering. "We face a turning point," said one of the councillors, a thin man with a voice sharp as a blade cutting through pretense. "The treaty with the Northern Kingdom demands guarantees, and nothing weakens a crown more than doubt about the legitimacy of its heir." Louis remained standing, refusing the offered seat as an act of subtle defiance. His hands were clasped behind his back, and though his posture remained rigid with tension, his voice emerged controlled and deliberate. "I will not deny what is now apparent to all," he stated, looking directly at the Duke, whose weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts. "The boys are mine by blood. Their existence is not negotiable, nor is my responsibility to them." A murmur rippled through the assembled dignitaries, but Louis continued without pause. "What is negotiable is how we proceed from this moment, whether with wisdom that recognizes truth, or with foolishness that perpetuates lies that have already cost us 7 years. The Duke's eyes narrowed fractionally, the only indication that Louis's words had struck a nerve. "You speak of truth," he said slowly, "yet you conducted this reunion in secrecy. You sheltered them within these walls without permission or announcement." Louis met his gaze without flinching. "I sought to understand before exposing them to this very situation. Judgment before knowledge, condemnation before consideration." The Chancellor stepped forward from the shadows where he had been observing with calculated detachment. "The question remains, what shall be done with the woman and her children? Their existence threatens the marriage contract being negotiated with Princess Adelina." Louis's face hardened into stone, his voice dropping to a dangerous register that few in the room had ever heard from him before. "Their existence threatens nothing but the convenient lies we've told ourselves," he replied. "And they are not her children. They are ours, mine and Claire's. The time for hiding truth behind protocol has ended." The silence that followed was absolute, a void into which no one dared speak, as the implication of his words sank into the consciousness of every person present. The game that had begun in a baker's shop now played out on the highest stage of the realm, with stakes higher than anyone had anticipated. The council chamber's atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with unspoken accusations and stifled ambitions. Louis stood before his father's council, shoulders squared despite the weight pressing down on him from all sides. The chancellor's voice sliced through the tension like a blade. "No one has questioned your loyalty to the duchy, yet," he said, emphasizing the final word with calculated precision. "But your silence regarding these public accusations makes you vulnerable, Your Highness. You must take a position, and you must take it now." Louis drew a deep breath, feeling every pair of eyes in the room boring into him. His father, the Duke, watched from his ornate chair, expression unreadable, yet somehow conveying both disappointment and expectation. "I will not deny there are children involved," Louis finally said, his voice steady despite the storm raging within. "Nor will I deny there is an evident connection." The room's silence grew heavier. "But until I possess the complete truth, I will make no declarations. It would be irresponsible and unjust." The Duke's gaze hardened, and Louis met it unflinchingly. "And she, Claire, is part of the truth I still lack," Louis continued without hesitation. "But I refuse to make hasty decisions. My commitment to the duchy is unwavering. I will not make public moves that might jeopardize our alliances." The words were delivered diplomatically, carefully crafted to appease the assembled noblemen. Yet someone ensured those very words would reach unintended ears, twisted and stripped of context. In another wing of the palace, Claire followed a maid, one of Madeleine's trusted servants, through dimly lit corridors. The woman had whispered that Louis had arranged a secret meeting, claiming they couldn't be seen together openly, that this was the only way to speak without raising suspicion. Claire had hesitated initially, something about the maid's overeager expression triggering a warning in her mind. But the desperate need for answers overpowered her caution. After days of uncertainty, of watching her children play blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around them, she would risk anything for clarity. The maid led her to a hidden gallery between the music rooms, where a concealed window overlooked the council chamber, covered only by tapestry thin enough to allow sound to pass through. Claire's heart pounded as she positioned herself in the shadows, straining to hear. She couldn't see faces clearly. She couldn't grasp the full context. But Louis's voice carried clearly enough for her to catch the fatal sentence. "My commitment to the duchy is unwavering. I will not make public moves that might jeopardize our alliances." The blood in her veins turned to ice. The maid watched her reaction with practiced sympathy that never reached her eyes. "It's for everyone's good, especially the children's," she whispered, her voice dripping with false compassion. Claire didn't respond. She withdrew silently, each step away from that hidden window, feeling like she was walking through deepening snow. While her movements remained controlled, something inside her was shattering into countless irreparable pieces. That night, Claire moved through her small farmhouse like a ghost. The children watched her warily during dinner, confused by their mother's stone-like silence. Even when Julian begged for a bedtime story, their nightly ritual she'd never once missed, she merely tucked them in, kissed their foreheads with trembling lips, and left the room with shoulders bent as though bearing the weight of mountains. For hours, she sat beside the cold fireplace, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into nothingness. No tears fell. No sobs escaped her throat. She simply accepted her fate like a soldier who knows she's lost the battle before firing a single shot. With dawn's first pale light, she rose mechanically. Her movements were precise as she packed only what they needed. Some food, the children's clothes, their papers, what little money she had saved, and a resolve as hard and unbreakable as diamond. She would not allow them to be used as pawns. She would not let her sons grow up in a world where their very existence was cause for shame. She had been foolish to believe love could withstand the crushing weight of a title, of a crown, of generations of aristocratic expectation. Louis hadn't denied them, but he hadn't defended them either. That lukewarm response cut deeper than outright rejection ever could. As she wrapped their meager belongings with automatic movements, Etienne stirred in his bed. his eyes still heavy with sleep, fixed on her with that uncanny perceptiveness that sometimes made her wonder if he could read souls. "We're leaving again," he said. Not a question, a resignation. Claire turned to him, swallowing past the tightness in her throat. "Yes, my love. Will we come back?" His voice was small, yet somehow ancient. She couldn't answer. The silence stretched between them, and though Etienne was barely 6 years old, something darkened in his eyes, an understanding deeper than mere childish disappointment. It was as if he could see something breaking within his mother, something fundamental that could never be mended. Claire woke Julian next, and together they slipped out through the back of the farmhouse as the first golden cold rays of dawn painted the fields. They walked with determined steps, all three wrapped in woolen cloaks, carrying what little they owned on their backs. They left no letter, no trace, only a final, devastating silence. That same dawn, Luis was returning to the farmhouse. He had spent the night in agonizing contemplation, furious with himself, with the council, with the entire world. Finally, he had understood that seeking the truth was not enough. He had to defend it with everything he possessed, his heart, his title, his name. He arrived determined to tell Claire that everything would change, that he was ready to face the Duke, the council, the scandal, all of it. For her, for the children, for what they all deserved. He jumped down from the carriage and strode purposefully along the muddy path, heart hammering with hope and newfound resolve. He knocked on the door. Silence answered him. He knocked again, harder this time, nothing. The silence was absolute, deafening in its completeness. He pushed the door open, it wasn't locked. The interior of the house was emptied of life. No blankets on the beds, no plates on the table, no laughter, no them. Only a small piece of cloth forgotten on the kitchen table caught his eye. Julian's handkerchief. Luis picked it up with trembling hands. A shadow slid across his chest, not from uncertainty, but from terrible certainty. Claire was gone again, and this time, he feared it might be forever. Wind howled with unusual ferocity around the towers of Lyon Palace, as if the very elements wished to announce that something precious had crumbled. In the corridors, servants avoided eye contact with nobles, knowing that a single glance might drag them into the whirlpool of rumors, swirling through the galleries with each hurried footstep. No one spoke loudly, but everyone knew. Claire Bont had vanished, taking the Duke's grandchildren with her. Luis barely slept. 4 days had passed since he found the empty farmhouse. 4 days of frantic searching, of exhausting rides along rural roads, of courteous interrogations that devolved into desperate pleas. No trace could be found at inns, markets, or well-traveled routes. It was as if Claire had dissolved into thin air with the children. The Duke received him in the audience chamber, his face hardened by the contempt only a father can feel when his dynasty is threatened by his son's heart. "The scandal has reached Paris," he said bluntly. "They speculate you've abandoned your duties for a woman who doesn't even have a surname." Madeleine, meanwhile, has handled the situation with grace. Each day you let pass, you lose strength, respect, allies. Luis didn't respond immediately. His beard was unkempt, his face pale, his clothes wrinkled from ceaseless travel. Yet in his eyes burned a determination that refused to be intimidated by titles or lineage. "I have no interest in the respect of those who hide their misery behind coats of arms," he finally replied, voice low but unwavering. The Duke's frown deepened, carving new lines into his aging face. "Then you will lose everything." Luis clenched his fists. "I already have." He left the office with his heart in ruins. With each step he felt Claire slipping further away. He cursed himself for not holding her back, for not saying the words that might have changed everything, for not understanding sooner that sometimes protecting what you love means breaking with everything else. Madeleine, meanwhile, moved through gilded halls with the skill of a serpent. She appeared serene, generous, concerned for the duchy's welfare. To outside eyes, she embodied sensibility and grace. Her dinners with high clergy, her visits to the royal orphanage, her discreetly pitying comments about the Duke's situation, everything was calculated. She knew she couldn't force Luis to love her, but she could eliminate his alternatives. Yet despite her machinations, Luis refused to yield. One night, as he pored over Claire's personal records, seeking something he might have missed, he received a visit from Victor. his former tutor and now head butler. The old man, loyal to the bone, carried a small wooden box. "Your Highness," he said softly, closing the door behind him. "I found this between the sheets in their former chamber. I don't know if she left it deliberately or simply forgot to hide it." Louise opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside, wrapped in a piece of white cloth, lay a child's silver medallion, a simple design engraved with a crescent moon, and 2 stars, identical to those worn by the boys. His fingers recognized it before his mind did. He had commissioned it years ago, when he still dreamed of having children. Opening the locket, he found a tiny note written in childish handwriting, "For when Papa wants to find us." And beneath the phrase, a small symbol drawn in pencil, a round loaf with 3 crossed marks in the center. Claire's bakery seal, a design she had invented to mark her products at the market, unique and easy to recognize. For the first time in days, Louise felt something dangerous ignite in his chest. Hope. Somewhere in the world, Claire was waiting to be found, and this time, he would not let her down. Louise held the medallion in his trembling hands, recognition flooding his veins with renewed purpose. His heart lurched in his chest as memories rushed back. He had commissioned these medallions years ago, dreaming of the children he might one day have. Without wasting a second, he summoned one of the palace's oldest guards, a weathered man who had served as a scout in the Northern Territories. "Do you recognize this symbol?" Louise asked, showing him the small drawing of the round loaf with 3 crossed marks. The guard narrowed his eyes, brow furrowing in concentration. "I saw this a few weeks ago at a coastal market in a fishing village north of Montelieu. It marked some bread bags." His eyes lit with certainty. "I remember thinking it curious. Hadn't seen that mark before." "You're absolutely certain?" Louise pressed, hope rising dangerously in his chest. "Completely certain, Your Grace." The man nodded with conviction. The bread was exceptional, tasted like home. Like home. The words echoed in Louise's mind as he raced to his chambers, changed into simple traveling clothes, and mounted his fastest horse. He departed that very night, taking no escort, announcing his destination to no one. He couldn't risk Madeleine discovering his plans. He wouldn't allow the same people who had torn Claire from him to interfere again. In the fishing village, Claire kneaded dough in silence at the back of an abandoned warehouse she had converted into a clandestine bakery. Her arms were covered in flour, her thoughts as heavy as millstones. Sleep had become a luxury she could no longer afford, not when nightmares of what she'd left behind haunted her darkest hours. Every night, the boys asked if they would ever see their father again. Every night, she avoided answering, convinced that silence was kinder than false promises. They shared a borrowed room with grain sacks and a thin mattress, a far cry from the farm's modest comfort, let alone the palace's luxury. She sold her bread in secret under an assumed name, her face always hidden behind a scarf, her eyes downcast to avoid customers' gazes. Claire Bont had ceased to exist. In her place stood only a mother, a shadow of her former self, surviving one day at a time for her children's sake. Yet each night, when Etienne and Julien finally succumbed to exhaustion, Claire would retrieve the medallion from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard and clutch it to her chest. Though she remained a mother above all else, she was still a woman who couldn't excise the love she had left behind from her soul, no matter how desperately she tried. Back at the palace, tension mounted with each passing hour. Ministers whispered in corridors, questioning the Duke's sudden disappearance. Madeleine, unsettled by Louise's absence, began dispatching discreet messengers to every corner of the duchy. She couldn't afford to lose control now, not when everything had been falling into place according to her designs. But Louise was neither lost nor wavering. He was hunting, driven by a purpose that transcended duty and title. The northern sky stretched like a grey sheet over fields of dry wheat as he rode without rest. The sea roared in the distance, hidden behind towering cliffs, its presence felt rather than seen. Louis pushed his mount forward relentlessly, guided only by the hope that bread marked with Claire's seal might still be sold somewhere along this rugged coast, and by the almost physical need to see his sons, to see Claire, to finally tell her the whole truth that had been buried beneath layers of manipulation and deceit. The sun was beginning its descent when the village came into view. The houses were low and humble, built of stone with thatched roofs weathered by salt and wind. The scent of the sea enveloped him instantly, mingling with the faint aroma of freshly baked bread that made his heart race with anticipation. In the distance, at a corner of the modest market square, he spotted a small improvised stall, covered with a tattered awning. A woman was selling bread, her face concealed by a grey scarf. Two children played nearby, identical in every way, tossing pebbles into the air with the carefree abandon only children possess. Twins. His twins. Luis pulled sharply on the reins. His horse stopped with a snort of protest, hooves scraping against the cobblestones. He dismounted with trembling hands, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. The woman looked up, her hands freezing mid-motion. Her eyes found his across the diminishing space between them, those unmistakable eyes he had dreamed of for years. Claire dropped the loaf she was holding. The children turned toward the commotion and saw him. "Papa!" one cried out, his voice carrying across the square like a bird taking flight. Luis stood, transfixed, unable to move, to breathe, to think. One of the boys, Julian, he realized with a start, ran toward him with an enormous smile that mirrored his own. Luis swept him up into his arms, holding him tightly, a laugh bubbling up from deep within that transformed into tears as he buried his face in his son's hair. Claire remained motionless, paralyzed between conflicting impulses, to run away, to scream, to fall to her knees. And then Luis looked at her, his breath ragged, his face streaked with tears of undisguised joy. "I found you," he said, his voice breaking. "This time, I won't leave without you." But at that very moment, two mounted figures appeared at the edge of the square. One wore a red coat emblazoned with golden insignia, the Royal Guard. A commanding voice rang out across the salt-laden air. "In the name of the Royal Council, Duke Luis must return to the palace immediately." The afternoon in the fishing village was fading slowly, painting the wet stones copper and leaving in the air that unmistakable scent of salt and burning wood. Fishing nets hung over shed walls, swaying like melancholy flags in the marine breeze. Luis advanced with measured steps, a ragged cloak covering him to his boots, his hat pulled low over his eyebrows. He no longer wished to draw attention to himself. His clothes were those of a common traveler, his fine mount resting in the stable of a modest inn at the village entrance. He carried only a small bag over his shoulder, and in his right hand, hidden within the folds of his coat, he clutched the child's medallion. The metal, warmed by his skin, was all that kept his hope burning. He had inquired cautiously, first to an old woman selling vegetables, then to the owner of a shop selling nails and rope. Finally, at the fish market, a young man pointed him toward a corner where, for the past few weeks, an unknown woman had been selling bread each morning, and at sunset. "She doesn't speak to anyone," the youth had told him, eyes curious. "But her children, God above, those boys look exactly like you." Luis stopped before the makeshift shop, a small wooden shed with a large window and a worn counter. Stone tables held baskets filled with small loaves, still warm from the oven. In one corner of the glass, etched with a needle, was the symbol he knew by heart, a round loaf with 3 crossed marks. Claire's seal. He felt his heart stutter before resuming its frantic rhythm, and then he saw them behind the counter, standing on a box to reach better. Julian was arranging bread with the concentration of someone who had performed this task countless times. Etienne, more restless, played with a piece of dough that clearly wasn't meant for sale. Beside them, an elderly woman supervised the transactions, exchanging coins with the few remaining customers of the day. Luis removed his hat slowly and took a step toward the entrance. The bell above the door chimed softly. Both boys looked up simultaneously. Julian's eyes widened like full moons. Etienne dropped the dough instantly. "Papa!" they shouted in unison, as if they had rehearsed this moment in their dreams. They ran toward him without hesitation, as if not a single day had passed since they last laughed together. Luis knelt just in time to receive them, embracing them tightly, one on each side, their small bodies pressed against his, their arms encircling him as if they never intended to let go. Luis felt his soul fill with something warm and immense. Love without conditions or boundaries. "I thought," Julian whispered against his neck, "you wouldn't find us anymore." Luis kissed the top of his head, unable to speak past the knot in his throat. It was then that he heard footsteps approaching from the back room. Claire emerged from the back of the shop, drying her hands on a linen cloth. Her walk was quick and distracted, like someone who only wanted to close up shop and end another exhausting day. But when she raised her eyes and saw him there, surrounded by their sons, she froze mid-step. Time suspended between them. Claire said nothing, only looked at him with eyes that held no anger, but rather a contained storm of fear, love, uncertainty, and bone-deep weariness. Luis rose slowly, still holding the boy's hands in his. "I found you," he murmured. "This time I won't leave without you." The old woman observed the scene with a raised eyebrow and without a word retreated to the back of the shop, understanding that this moment belonged to no one but them. That night, the stone cabin Claire rented in exchange for bread and help cleaning the harbor was quiet. The boys slept deeply in the warmest corner, their bodies exhausted by the day's emotions. Luis and Claire sat at the small kitchen table, illuminated only by the gentle glow of an oil lamp that cast long shadows across their faces. Luis placed a leather folder on the table between them. "I want you to see this," he said softly. Claire didn't move, her hands clasped tightly before her. He opened the folder with the care of someone handling open wounds. Inside lay the evidence he had gathered, a copy of the original letter he had written before their separation, the one that had never received a response. Beside it, the manipulated version Claire had read, with that devastating line, "Don't search for false hopes," that had shattered her world. "This was orchestrated," Luis explained, his voice low but intense. "They intercepted my letter. They dictated another to a council scribe. They sealed it with my signature." His eyes met hers, pleading for understanding. "Victor discovered it when we were reviewing the archives after your disappearance. He withdrew a second document from the folder. And there's more. A report about a missing scribe whose handwriting matches the false letter." Claire's fingers hovered over the papers, not quite touching them, as if they might burn her. "Who would do this?" she whispered, though in her heart she already knew the answer. "Someone who stood to gain from our separation," Luis replied, the words bitter on his tongue. "Someone who wanted to ensure I fulfilled my duty to the duchy, by any means necessary." Claire finally took the original letter, her eyes scanning the words Luis had actually written all those years ago. Words of love, of commitment, of plans for a future together. Words that had never reached her. "All this time," she said, her voice breaking, "I thought you had discarded us when faced with your duty." "I would never choose duty over you, over them." Luis reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of touching hers. "Claire, I've been searching for you since the moment I realized you were gone. I never stopped looking." She looked up at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "And now that you've found us, what happens now, Luis? You're still a duke, and I'm still just a baker with no name." Luis shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips. "You've never been just anything, Claire, and I'm more than just a duke. I'm a father who wants to be with his children. I'm a man who has never stopped loving you." He reached into his pocket and placed something on the table between them. The third medallion, identical to those worn by their sons. "I had these made when I still dreamed of having a family," he said quietly, "before I knew what it truly meant to lose one." Claire's hand finally moved to touch the medallion, her fingers brushing against his. "They ask about you every night," she whispered. "They never doubted you would come." "Children often see truths that adults miss," Luis replied. "I won't ask you to return to the palace. Not yet. But I won't leave you again. And I won't hide the truth any longer. The world will know that Etienne and Julien are my sons, and that their mother is the woman I choose to love." In the quiet of that humble cabin, with the sound of the sea washing against the shore outside and their children sleeping peacefully nearby, something long broken began the slow, fragile process of healing. Not with grand declarations or passionate embraces, but with the simple acknowledgement of truths too long buried. and with the promise that this time no one would tear them apart again. The bakery bell rang again. This time it wasn't just another villager in search of warm bread. It was him, the Duke. Rain clung to his coat like guilt he could never wash away. His boots struck the floor with purpose, yet his eyes were unsure, two storms hidden beneath a crown of entitlement. Mia froze, the wooden tray in her hands trembling slightly. One of the loaves rolled off and hit the floor. Time stilled. She hadn't seen him in 6 years, not since that night. Not since the whispers, the scandal, the exile. And now here he stood, taller, colder, yet undeniably him. His gaze shifted slowly, first to her, then to the two small figures behind the counter, two boys 6 years old. The Duke staggered inward. He didn't breathe, couldn't. Mia moved instinctively, stepping in front of the boys like a shield of flesh and trembling courage. "Leave," she whispered, but he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, his voice cracked like old wood. "Are they mine?" She didn't blink. "You have no right to ask that." The children looked up, wide-eyed, sensing the tremor in the air, but not understanding its weight. One of them, Elias, peeked from behind her skirt. His curiosity was stronger than fear. The resemblance was too loud to ignore. It echoed in his chin, his posture, the way he tilted his head in wonder. The Duke bent down, slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Elias." The other twin clung to Mia's apron, silent. The name hit him like a dagger. That name, his brother's name, the one who had died protecting him. His legs gave way slightly, and he gripped the counter for balance. "I need to know the truth," he said, voice strained. 6 years ago, you left without a word, without a trace." Mia's expression hardened. "Because you were about to marry another woman, a duchess, for power, not love." He lowered his head. "I didn't choose that. My father—" "Your father isn't here," she cut him off. "You are." Only the crackling of the fire in the oven dared to speak. Then suddenly the older woman who owned the bakery, Doña Livia, stepped forward. Her face was lined with time and secrets. "They deserve to know," she said softly. Mia turned to her, shocked. "No!" But the Duke took a step forward. "Please." Mia stared at him, searching for remnants of the man she once loved. Not the title, not the crown, but the boy who gave her violets on the first day of spring. She saw glimpses of him now in the brokenness of his gaze. "I was 17, she said, her voice trembling like a leaf. "I was in love with a dream, and I paid the price." Tears welled in her eyes but did not fall. "They're yours, both of them." The truth exploded in the room without noise, just a heavy, devastating stillness. The Duke fell to his knees, not out of shame, but out of awe, of sorrow, of guilt. The boys watched, confused. One stepped forward, placing a tiny hand on his shoulder. "You look sad," he said. The Duke looked up, tears tracing down his cheeks. "I am," he whispered. "I've been sad for a very long time." Mia couldn't bear it. She turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. He stood up slowly. "Let me be part of their life. I'm not asking for forgiveness and just a chance." But Mia shook her head, still facing away. "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for. It's something you earn." "Then let me try," he said. She turned to face him, and for the first time he saw not the girl he had lost, but the woman who had survived. "There's a lot you don't know," she said, eyes sharp. "About what happened after you left, about the letters I sent, about the price I paid to protect them from your world." He blinked. Letters. She walked past him, opened a drawer, and dropped a bundle of unopened envelopes on the table. His seal, never opened. "My father," he whispered. "He lied to me." She nodded. "And now you know what that lie cost." Doña Livia stepped forward again. "The question is, what will you do now?" The Duke looked at the twins, then at Mia, then at the past he could never undo, and the future he might still reclaim. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small carved wooden horse, old, worn, once his. He placed it gently on the table between them. "For them," he said. Mia stared at the toy. It had been his, the same one he'd given her when they were children, the same one she had buried in a box 6 years ago. A sign, a heartbeat from another life. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no, but she didn't throw it away. And that, for now, was enough. As the Duke stepped out into the rain, he looked back one last time. The twins were watching him through the window, and for the first time in years, he smiled, not as a duke, but as a father. But just as he turned the corner, a shadow detached from the alley, one that had been watching everything. And not everyone wanted the truth to be known. The rain hadn't stopped. It had simply grown colder, like the world itself held its breath. The Duke walked in silence, his boots heavy with questions he hadn't yet dared to ask. Behind him, the lights of the bakery faded into the fog, and the memory of his son's eyes haunted each step forward. But he wasn't alone. From the shadowed edge of a nearby alley, a figure detached itself from the stone. Cloaked in oil-black wool, the man moved like smoke, silent, watchful, purposeful. He followed without urgency, as though he'd been expecting this moment for years. Inside the bakery, Mia still stood motionless. The wooden horse lay on the table between the past and present, its small frame holding more weight than any crown. Her hands gripped the edge of the drawer where the letters had been buried. Doña Livia watched her closely. "You've awakened something that's been buried a long time, child." "I didn't have a choice," Mia replied softly. "They had to know." Livia nodded, but her eyes darkened. "And now, others will know too." Outside, the cloaked figure rounded the corner just as the Duke turned onto the main avenue. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, long enough for memory to crack the surface. "Casimir," the Duke said under his breath. The man stepped into the light, scarred, clean-shaven, eyes like fractured glass. A ghost of the court, the former advisor of his father, the one who had vanished after the coronation. "You were supposed to be dead," the Duke said, his voice barely above a whisper. Casimir smiled, cold and sharp. "So were you." Lightning split the sky. Inside the bakery, Mia tucked the boys into a cot behind the oven. They didn't ask questions. Children often sensed what adults tried to hide. She kissed their foreheads, then turned to Livia. "There's more," Mia said. "He didn't just come back for them. I saw it in his face. He's carrying something." "Regret?" Livia asked. "No," Mia whispered. "A warning." Back in the street, Casimir stepped closer, his coat trailing like a shadow. "You've broken the pact, Your Grace. You went to her. You saw the children." The Duke clenched his jaw. "I had to know the truth." Casimir nodded. "And now you do. But truth has consequences." The Duke moved fast, grabbing Casimir by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "You intercepted her letters. You made me believe she had vanished. You lied." Casimir didn't resist. He simply stared. "I obeyed your father," he said, "and you have inherited more than just his name." The Duke's grip loosened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Casimir leaned in, voice like smoke, "that your father's sins are still alive. And they're watching. The council knows you found her, they know about the children, and they will not allow the bloodline to be compromised." The word struck like a blow to the chest. Compromised. The Duke staggered back. "They're just children." Casimir straightened his coat. "Children born of a peasant woman. Children who could fracture the line of succession if acknowledged. You know the law." "The law is broken," the Duke growled. Casimir's eyes gleamed. "And those who try to fix it often end up broken too." The wind howled through the street like a dying scream. Inside the bakery, Mia lit a candle and unfolded a small piece of parchment. A map. Crude, hastily drawn, marked with an X just beyond the old vineyards. She hadn't looked at it in years. Not since the night she fled. Not since the man in the shadows gave it to her and whispered, "If they ever come for the children, go here." She hadn't believed him then. Now she wasn't sure she had time not to. The Duke walked away from Casimir without another word, but his mind burned, his heart split. Each memory of Mia's face mixed with the council's cruel demands, the ancient codes, the sacrifices already made in silence. He needed to protect them, even if it meant becoming an enemy to his own crown. That night, as the fire dimmed and the children slept, Mia stood at the window watching the empty street. She sensed the shift in the air, like something old had awakened and wouldn't go quietly. Livia approached her slowly. "There's something I never told you." Mia turned. "What?" Livia hesitated. "Your mother didn't die in childbirth like they said." The silence was a blade. "She was taken," Livia continued, "by the same men who now watch your sons." Mia stepped back, shaken. "Why would they?" "Because she too loved someone above her station, someone powerful, dangerous." Mia's knees buckled slightly. "And the council," Livia nodded. "They erased her from the books, from the church, from memory." Suddenly, the past wasn't just a shadow, it was a cycle, and her sons were next. At the edge of the city, in a cold stone chamber lined with emblems of power, the High Council gathered. Casimir stood before them, head bowed. "He knows," he said. A frail man with hollow eyes leaned forward. "And the woman. She knows more than she should." The council leader raised a hand. "Then it is time to finish what the old Duke began." A new decree was signed, blood-red wax stamped with a raven's seal. "Eliminate the threat." Back at the bakery, the candle flickered violently. Mia looked up, and for the first time since the night she fled the palace, she felt hunted. Outside, beneath the bakery's window, a pair of boots waited, watching, measuring, waiting for the right moment to burn everything down. The scent of old parchment lingered in the damp air as Elric paced the candlelit corridors beneath the monastery ruins. His thoughts swirled like storm tides, Eleanor's secret, the oracle's cryptic words, and the growing dissonance between the world he knew and the truth now clawing its way to the surface. The parchment he clutched trembled in his hands. It bore her name, her true name. Not the alias she used as a fugitive, but a name once whispered in prayer and curses across the fractured kingdom. It was not merely a name. It was a sigil that unlocked a lineage older than the throne, entangled with ancient rites and fallen bloodlines. Elric stopped beneath an archway crumbling with moss and lichen, heart pounding. Elena of the Hollow Flame. He mouthed the name like a confession. It tasted of prophecy, fire, and grief. Everything in him screamed to run, to flee from the firestorm her truth could ignite. But part of him, the part not yet shattered by exile and war, yearned to understand. Above ground, the sky bruised with twilight. Elena stood by the skeletal remains of an altar, wind tugging at her cloak. Her gaze was fixed not on the horizon but inward. Since the trial, something in her had fractured, not broken but twisted into something sharper. The villagers saw her as a witch, the Inquisition as a threat. But Elric saw the shadow beneath her skin, alive, sentient and watching. She could feel it too, a presence that whispered in mirrors and water, echoing her thoughts with chilling precision. That night they met in the crypt's heart. He came with the scroll in hand, she came with silence. No greeting, no accusation, only breath and eyes, weary and bright. Elric laid the parchment between them on the stone table. "Is it true?" he asked, though he already knew. Elena's nod was imperceptible, yet it struck him like a hammer. "Then you are—" He didn't finish. The air had grown too thick with unspoken things. She traced a finger along the edge of the scroll, her voice barely more than a breath. "I was born into fire, not as a witch but as a vessel." Her shadow flickered against the wall like a second soul. "The hollow flame is not a myth. It breathes through blood, my blood. I didn't choose it, it chose me." Her eyes met his, no longer hiding. And now, it's awakening. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a verdict. Outside, the wind howled through broken chapels and empty cloisters, carrying with it the scent of storms and endings. Elric knew the Inquisition would not stop. They would hunt her down, not for what she did, but for what she was. And when they came, They would not come with torches alone. Eleanor stepped closer, the flames in her eyes flickering between sorrow and defiance. "You should leave, Elric. You've already lost too much." But he didn't move. "I lost my kingdom," he said, voice steady, "but not my judgment." He touched her hand, not as a warrior or a savior, but as a man walking willingly into fire. "If the world is to burn, let me burn beside you." The shadows danced around them, listening. Elena's hand tightened around his. "Then let us light the match." The first strike came with no warning, an arrow slicing through the sky, embedding itself into the stone just inches from Elena's hand. The monastery's ruins erupted with cries, boots thundering on sacred earth. The Inquisition had arrived, cloaked not just in steel and fire, but in prophecy. They came not to capture, but to extinguish. And at the center of their fury stood Elena, no longer a fugitive, but the flame they feared most. Elric drew his sword with the certainty of a man who had nothing left to protect, but one thing: her. Around them, the night ignited. Flaming arrows rained down like judgment, casting grotesque shadows upon the walls as soldiers stormed the courtyard. Eleanor's eyes flared golden, her breath sinking with a deeper rhythm, one ancient, one divine. She could feel it. The hollow flame within her stirred, no longer dormant, no longer chained. The altar behind her cracked with heat. Stones bled with light. Elric moved to defend her, blade meeting steel, his every strike powered by conviction rather than crown. The soldiers outnumbered them, but none matched the fury that now flowed from Eleanor's form. She stepped into the storm, wind twisting around her like a veil. Her voice rose, not in screams, but in a chant, a forgotten tongue, a sacred invocation, one that split the sky itself. Lightning tore across the heavens, striking the altar. Fire erupted, not burning but transforming. It surged around her, consuming her cloak, revealing markings along her arms that glowed like starlight. The soldiers faltered, some retreating, others shouting in terror. "Witch!" they cried. "Demon!" But Elric saw none of that. He saw a woman becoming what fate had buried. He saw a queen of flame. In the chaos, an inquisitor advanced. Black robes, silver blade, eyes like cold ash. He struck fast, aiming not for Eleanor, but for Elric. The sword sank into his side. Elric gasped, staggering, eyes locking with hers one final time. "Don't fall," he whispered. "Finish it." His knees buckled, blood pooling at his feet. But even as the pain consumed him, he smiled. Not in defeat, in absolution, Eleanor screamed. Not from fear, but from awakening. Her hands rose and the very stones responded. The monastery pulsed with energy, every pillar humming with forgotten power. The Inquisitor lunged again, but this time she caught the blade mid-air. It dissolved in her grip like paper. "You hunted me," she said, voice layered with 1,000 echoes. "Now meet the truth you feared." She released the flame. It wasn't fire in the way mortals understood. It was memory, origin. It swept through the soldiers, peeling away their armor, their anger, their lies. Some collapsed weeping, others fled. And when the storm passed, only ash remained, gentle, falling like snow. The land grew still. The fire receded. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside Elric, cradling his face. His breath was shallow, his eyes barely open. "Did you see it?" she asked, tears mixing with blood. He nodded weakly. "You were the dawn," he murmured. "Always." A final breath, then stillness. Elena wept, not just for him, but for the innocence they lost, the kingdom that betrayed them and the love that bloomed in its ruins. But the world was not done with her. From the ashes rose the people, villagers, wanderers, those who had watched from afar. They came not to judge, but to kneel. They had seen the falsehood in the fire. Now they saw her truth. Eleanor stood, weary but whole. In her hand, she held not a crown, but a spark, a promise. The hollow flame had chosen its vessel, not to destroy, but to renew. She walked through the ruined gates alone, but not lonely. Her path ahead was unknown, but for the first time she did not fear it. Behind her lay a fallen kingdom. Ahead, a world reborn. and deep within her the flame pulsed softly, not as a weapon, but as a heartbeat. The story of the exiled duke and the condemned witch had ended, but the legend of the flame-born queen was only beginning. Years passed, yet the tale of the flame-born queen continued to echo through valleys and across mountain winds. Bards sang her name in hushed reverence, not as myth, but as memory. Eleanor was never seen wearing a crown, yet her legacy ruled hearts. The lands she once walked bloomed anew, not through conquest but compassion. Whispers told of a woman who appeared in burning villages to calm the flames, of a healer with golden eyes who spoke to the stars. Children asked if she still lived. Elders claimed she had become one with the hollow flame, guiding those who dared to rise from ruin. But only a few knew the truth. Deep in the northern cliffs, a candle always burns in a stone chamber, beside a sword laid to rest and a cloak folded with care. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, it carries her laughter. Soft, defiant, eternal. For some stories end, but legends only sleep. If this story touched you, if it stirred something deep within your soul, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next legend waiting to be told. Hit the like button to let this story burn brighter, and share it with someone who still believes in love, in magic, and in second chances. And if you felt the spark, save this video. Let it be the flame you return to when the world feels cold.